kohtumisele HEADREAD kirjandusfestivalile oli kirjanike kõrval kutsutud ka üks jutuvestja ja nii mõnigi ajaloolane. Kas jutuvestja, kes pajatab muinasjutte midagi kirja panemata, on osa kirjandusest? Kas ajaloolane, kes saagade, arheoloogiliste leidude ja muude kirjalike materjalide põhjal minevikku taas luua püüab, on samuti mingil määral kirjanik? Missugused teadmised meil viikingitest on puha valed ja missugused vastavad pigem tõele? Seda võib lugeda Philip Bakeri eesti keelde tõlgitud uuringust Põhjalaste raev.
Combing the hair, took a long time during the day, so you wouldn't necessarily want to appear in battle looking like a complete mess. But neatly groomed before you hacked a few heads off was probably the kind of the Viking ethos. On the other hand, there's a record of an Arabic traveller who went on an embassy to up the Volga to the Volga Bulgars in about 920. So he was the secretary, Ibn Fadlan, to this embassy. And he just described a lot of Viking habits, and the hair combing is one thing, but he was absolutely disgusted by their level of hygiene in other ways. That although they washed their hands and faces, everybody shared the same bowl to do so, which rather goes against the whole point of the hygiene. Whereas obviously in Arabic tradition, people were very, very careful and fastidious about the hand washing. And he also describes a ship burial, where a local chieftain is being buried in a ship and the ship will be burnt. But there's an absolutely appalling description of the sacrifice of probably one of the female servants of the chieftain who had died, who is absolutely brutalized, and effectively there's a gang rape by the lieutenants of the dead man, and then she's drugged before this happens, and then her neck is broken and she's shoved into the ship and the ship is burnt. So although the combing is nice, there are other elements of Viking habits which are not the kind of things we would necessarily want to reintroduce into modern European culture. My main specialisation is, in fact, it's early medieval history. So my period of principal interest runs from probably about the 6th century, right at the start of the Age of Migrations, until about the 11th or 12th century. So just a little bit before the foundation of Tallinn. In my book, I cover the whole of the Viking world. So right actually from when the Vikings migrated across the North Atlantic and ended up in North America, to the Viking raids on Britain and Ireland, and obviously in Scandinavia, but also those Vikings who went eastwards, mainly from Sweden, who came into the Baltic states, and also down the river systems into Ukraine and Russia. Absolutely, this part of the world is a vital part of the Viking world, and is included in my book. In its original and classic sense, a Viking was simply somebody who undertook that way of life. To go Viking was simply to become a maritime raider, to go abroad and to raid, and hopefully to bring back plunder and treasure, and particularly and importantly glory back home. So you might say that in one sense almost anybody who partook of that way of life could count as a Viking in that era. It's interesting that the people who in the sagas are sort of set up on a pedestal as the most successful Vikings of all are probably a group who didn't exist at all. So there's a group called the Jomsvikings, who may have lived, in somewhere kind of, somewhere in the kind of central to eastern Baltic's southern shore. Some people say in northern Poland. Some people are not so sure. But they were always, by all the others, this was the ideal of a Viking, and they lived in this fortified harbour. No women were allowed, to allow them to carry on with their heroic drinking sessions uninterrupted by any women folk.
The Vikings settled or traded or raided all along the eastern Baltic shorelines. So there are cases recorded, not precisely dated, of Viking raids in this part of the world in the 8th century, around 750 or 800, one of the very early Viking sagas, the Ynglinga saga, talks about the Swedish king Ingvar who attacked this part of the world and attacked Estonia and Latvia. So definitely this part of the world does play a role in the Viking sagas. In the Baltic there was a kind of international maritime culture, and part of that was Viking and Viking raiding, and there's I think a story that's very well known in Estonian schools of Estonian pirates who attacked Sweden and burnt the Swedish royal capital Sigtuna in 1187 and stole the doors from the royal palace, which actually ended up in Novgorod. So Estonians played a part in this international maritime culture, and they used similar ships. In fact, in 2008, 2010, 2 ships of this era were found, the Salme ships were found. Quite who they belong to, whether they belong to Swedish Vikings attacking or the other way around, can't be so clear. But it's certainly clear that Estonia played a role in this culture, and Estonians were doing the same sort of things. There are cultural and artistic differences between the Baltic peoples and the Vikings, which enable archaeologists to differentiate. So although they played a part in this kind of grander culture which was going on, they were not the same.
Estonia's unique contribution to Viking history in terms of the boats which were found at Saaremaa. There's one from the late 8th century, about 750, which is probably the earliest example that we have of a Viking age sailing boat, because although previously we had pictures of Viking ships from Gotland, from picture stones there, which clearly showed ships which had sails, which from that sort of period, there was a big gap in the archaeological record. It wasn't that the Vikings had just said, okay, we got sails now, we are going straight away to start raiding the coast of northwestern Europe. It shows that there were at least 50 years or so of experience in the use of this kind of maritime technology before the actual period of the Great Raids occurred. So that was the kind of, probably the biggest kind of Estonian story in the book. And it's, in Viking terms generally, it's a really big story. The final discovery that the Vikings really did land in North America, which was, it was a discovery in the early 1960s, but it actually resolved an issue which had been argued about a lot amongst modern historians since the 19th century and just discussed and considered for centuries. That we had the evidence from several sagas which discussed Viking landings in North America, but there was never any actual genuine concrete proof of that. And then in 1961-62, the site at Lonsdale Meadow in Newfoundland was discovered. And that did several things, one of which is it said, okay, really the Vikings managed this astonishing leap right the way across the North Atlantic with several stepping stones on the way. They really did get to North America. The other thing which it did was to say, well, the sagas actually, those sagas did contain that kernel of truth. The Vikings have got just that particular reputation for being fierce and ruthless and particularly destructive. And that is probably just a function of the fact that the peoples whom they attacked were, on the whole, had become literate and were able to write down accounts. The Vikings, or people from Iceland, produced the richest literature in their own language, in the vernacular, that really exists from that earlier and mid-portion of the Middle Ages. So not only do we have the side of the people who were being attacked by the Vikings, but we also have a wealth of sources actually from the Vikings, from the Scandinavians themselves, which makes a unique mix.
What is this relationship between writing history and writing fiction?
Well, obviously, a key part of history is, out of all the very, very many events, some of which are well attested, some of which are not, some of which are only guessed at, a key part of it is assembling a narrative which makes sense. In any given historical period, there are a number of narratives you might assemble. So in that way, a historian also plays the role of a storyteller, not necessarily creating a fiction, but creating a way by which people can understand events in the past. So the role of a novelist and the role of a historian are in some way allied in that way. A historian, often, particularly in the early period, also has to play the role of a detective. as in a detective novel, has to decide which of the many pieces of evidence actually can be trusted, which of the many pieces of evidence can be put together to create that story. So there's not a complete, I think, divide between those who write novels or fiction or detective novels and historians in that sense.
So you weren't surprised to be asked here in Estonia?
Yeah, I was not surprised. I was indeed very delighted, and particularly because Estonia plays a part in what I've written. So it was absolutely fantastic to get the opportunity to come here.
Do you have contacts with Estonian historians as well?
Unfortunately, I don't as yet. In Sweden and Norway and Denmark and Ireland, yes, but not so far with Estonian historians. But if any of them would like to have a word or be in touch, I'd be absolutely delighted. One of the things I found most fascinating about this period is it cuts across a lot of preconceptions. It cuts across the age-old narrative perhaps of East against West, or even Northern Europe against Southern Europe.
I don't do as publishers tell me, unfortunately. I'm a very rebellious and unruly author. The Vikings and Scandinavian history was something that I had always been interested in, just for reasons of that interest in the way in which kind of medieval states in Europe formed as a consequence of the age of migrations and the Germanic invasions. I was kind of interested in taking that just a little bit further. And there was also, deep in my family history, another reason for me to look at the Vikings, in that my great-grandfather, who died long before I was born, was Norwegian. I spent a little time in the British diplomatic service for a couple of years, and then I spent 11 years actually working in publishing, working in historical publishing. My particular specialty was illustrated history books, like historical atlases. But in terms of my educational background, at university I studied history at Cambridge University, and I tried my very best to avoid studying anything that was remotely modern history. And I spent all of my time studying early medieval history. I think temperamentally, I've always been interested in those niches in history, the kind of things that very often people are not looking at, the kinds of things which are perhaps glossed over sometimes in the mainstream grand narratives of history. So when I studied Anglo-Saxon history, for example, I was most interested in the period of the invasions, the period of the formation, the period before the Anglo-Saxon states really formed. When I studied Roman history, I was most interested not in Julius Caesar or Augustus, not even Nero or Tiberius. I was most interested in the later Roman Empire. I was more interested in the mechanisms by which the empire began to decay and its strategies for survival, and also the histories of the Germanic peoples who eventually overran the empire.
But in Britain, this period of Vikings, is it quite popular?
I think it's increasingly popular. There was probably a time 30 or 40 years ago when it wasn't so much looked at. But now every school child has to study the Vikings. It's now part of the curriculum. And also I think people are interested in it, people are fascinated in it, because there's this group of people who came, who contributed a certain amount to the kind of the political construction, and then apparently disappeared. It's obviously not entirely true, because if you do DNA analysis of people in certain parts of England, particularly Scotland, you'll find the traces of Scandinavian descent there. So although politically they were not successful in conquering England and Scotland in the end, they left their traces. They touched the language too. A lot of basic words in English, basic words like the, sky, very basic words, are actually originally Viking words, Danish words. The Vikings obviously ended up in northern France and became the Normans, who subsequently conquered England. So some things we got transmitted that way. So we were in England, we were conquered by the Vikings several times. Even in Spain, there's a famous Viking raid in Spain, which was not successful. They got off their ships and were captured and enslaved by the local emir of Cordoba, where they could be found apparently several decades later as the best cheesemakers in Spain. It's not something one thinks of the Vikings.
So just to take a simple example, one of the things that almost everybody knows about the Vikings, but which isn't true, is that the Vikings wore horned helmets. And it's absolutely not true. No horned helmets, absolutely at all. However, this came about as part of the revival of Scandinavian nationalism in the 19th century. People in Stockholm began to have Viking revival balls. And it's not exactly clear how, but it was probably some opera props from Wagnerian opera props that happened to be at the back when they were having their opera. And so they wore them. The same thing happens now, that if there's a medium which addresses the wide public, then whatever subject, if it addresses a historical subject, well, it'll become fashionable, it'll become trendy, and sometimes good things come out of that in terms of kind of informing people. Sometimes there will be something in that that's very enticing. It may be something as simple as horned helmets, and then that just sticks. And it takes 100 books to kind of write what's said in one film if it's not correct.
Tõe ja vale teemaga tegeles HEADREAD kirjandusfestivalil ka Walesi jutuvestja David Ambrose, kes mõtiskles 3 muinasjutust koosnevas etenduses selle üle, kui kaugel on tõde valest.
Truth or lies? Truth or lies? And what's the difference? And what will happen if we go down one road? Will it be all the difference in the world if we've taken the other road? In fact, you know how it is. The world is round. You set off in one direction. If you walk long enough, you'll come back in the other direction. So you might set off down the road of truth, but find yourself on the road of lies. We shall see.
The Welsh talk about this in terms of music. They say, oh, we're a musical nation. But actually, they're leaving it to somebody else to be musical. And I think that I've talked to Irish friends and storytellers, and they say the same thing. The Irish think that they're a nation of storytellers. But certainly the telling of the stories in the old way began to decline, but then I think we've seen in the last 20 years a real revival. And now there are storytelling festivals springing up. I have run a festival of my own in Wales, and through that we're connected to international storytelling festivals all across Europe. And it's really growing and growing and growing. And people are rediscovering the joy of telling, and they're rediscovering the joy of simply listening without big screen, without soundtrack, without big props and bangs and flashes and smoke. Of course, there are tricks. The storyteller is using tricks, but they're very limited and pared down, and there's something really enjoyable for that, for the listener. One of the things I've come to understand is that it takes two. It's the storyteller, but also the listener. Both are doing the work, and the listener is doing the work of imagining everything, because the storyteller isn't giving them very much. A few facial expressions, a few gestures, and a few words. But you leave a lot to the imagination, and I think that's the joy for the listener. The listener is conjuring this world up, and every person in the audience has got slightly different pictures in their heads. I love movies, I love the cinema, but so much is done for you. You're told what to think, what to see.
My old friend, Truth, what are you doing here? How is life treating you? And Truth, in her little pile of rags in the doorway, she looks up, and she's looking into the face of her old friend, Falsehood. My friend, she says, the fact is life is not treating me very well. Ever since I came to this town, I've received nothing but kicks and curses. I've had no food for 4 days. Nobody wants to know me. Nobody wants to hear what I have to say.
Stories like that I've been telling for quite a long time now. I started professionally about 15 years ago. For a storyteller, that means I started late. it would be much better if I had grown up being a storyteller, listening to storytellers right from the start. That's the old way. But that way of life is almost gone. Certainly in Northern Europe and Western Europe, many of us tried to become storytellers later in life, and it all depends when you came across storytelling, really. It is partly earliest influences, and even if I didn't grow up listening to traditional stories, because like most kids in the West, I grew up with children's television and cartoons and classic children's books, but I didn't have anybody just telling me the old fairy tales out of their heads, as used to happen. But I had Dad who was too busy a lot of the time, but on those rare times when he was on holiday, he was actually rather a good storyteller. My delight in summer holidays would be to climb into bed with my father. Maybe my mother would get up and she'd go down and get the breakfast, and my dad, for just those few days, wouldn't be hurrying off to the office, and then he would just make up stories, very often about a small boy who was having adventures, and of course I knew that that was me in those stories. So I had that. I had a mother who was very good at recounting things that she had seen, telling them very vividly. My father died when I was quite young. I was away at boarding school a lot. My mother would go on holiday, often on her own. And whenever she came back, we looked forward to it, my sister and I, because she always came back with a really vivid description. Something would happen to my mother. My mother is one of those people things happen to. And actually I believe that probably things happen to all of us, but it's the storytellers who can recount those things in a way that makes them funny or vivid or exciting. So my mother had that gift. She didn't have the same gift that my father had of just making something up out of her head, but between them, they definitely influenced me. And at the same time, I have to say, it was a long time before it ever occurred to me that you could take the old stories, not just have them in a book, but you could actually just simply tell them, as I was doing here today.
Truth and falsehood, they found themselves walking along, side by side, down the road, bellies empty, throats full of dust, but not so full that falsehood couldn't turn to truth and say, "That went well, didn't it?" You know, the thing about us too, my friend, Lady Truth, the thing about us too, is that we're really closer than you might think. You and I. There's not such a great distance between us.
And I had to wait a long time until more than 20 years ago when I was in my 40s and I saw my first real storyteller. And then, as we say in English, the penny dropped. He was doing with, say, Grimm's stories or Irish stories. He was telling these stories. And they were stories I knew, but I only had ever found them in books. He had taken them out of the books and was setting them free again. Really, the book is not the proper place for a story. It's a bit like a zoo. It's a place where you keep the endangered species until they're ready to go back into the wild. My usual preference, my real joy actually, is to tell the old stories, the traditional stories, wherever they come from.
And the servants will run into the room and they will give Mahmoud such a beating. And finally, they will realize who it is that they are beating. And Mahmoud, he will be so ashamed. And Mahmoud, he hasn't got the wit, the imagination to make up a story, so he'll tell his wife the whole truth. And it will be a lesson he will never forget.
Take this one I've just done, for instance. This is a part of a bigger program, actually. But I knew that I wanted to do something that was exploring truth and lies and had a little bit of philosophy in it. And so I set out to find stories. Now, there were some stories, oh yes, I thought, oh, yeah, I heard that story. Where did I hear it? Who told me? And how does it go exactly? And nowadays you can Google, you know, but I didn't find it on Google. And then I started writing to friends of mine, and then one of my friends said, I think I saw it in a book somewhere. I think it's in a book by so and so. And so then I found the book, and I discovered I had that book. It was on my bookshelf, but I'd forgotten. Then the next bit of work you have to do is somehow make it your own. So, and this is the interesting part. This is where the author comes in, really. Even though you're not writing it down, you are kind of composing it in your head. And you choose which way to tell it, what angle to take, which words, which bits do you keep, and which bits could you get rid of. Many of the Celtic stories have things that happen in threes, because that was a very sacred number. If you change that, you're changing something very fundamental. But there are other things you can change. Obviously you can choose your own words, but maybe you put a different slant, a different interpretation. The good storyteller is not learning it word for word and just reciting it.
Well, it was a long time since Mahmoud had climbed a tree. He probably hadn't done it since he was a small boy, actually. And now he was a big, heavy merchantman, dressed in a very big, heavy robe with a big, heavy turban on his head, and he's pulling himself up and through the branches higher and higher, and it's hard work, but finally he reaches up and he gets his fingers onto the balcony, his wife's balcony.
I spent several years in a theatre company when I was much younger. That was also a help to me. I didn't realise it at the time, but some of what I did then came back because it was a quite experimental theatre. It was improvised theatre, some of it. And it was very much like the storytelling. There wasn't necessarily a fixed text. I mean, this was quite a radical thing. This was in the very early 1970s. And we were putting on performances in quite big but kind of underground theatres in London. And we developed, as a company, we developed a storyline, but it was never ever written down. We arrived at it through improvisation, and then we just repeated it every night, which gave you great freedom because you never had to think, oh, am I being true to the great author's text? You know, I mustn't get a word wrong. And you're free. I made one big mistake in the middle of my story, and I had to get myself out of it. I had to dig myself out of a hole because there was a very vital bit of information that I forgot to tell you. I forgot. So anyway, that's part of the skill, I hope. I left that piece out, but I just stitch it back in here instead. That's what you can do if you're not afraid of sticking to the text, because actually it's your text, you made it, so you can do what you like with it.
He knew he was in the presence of truth. And he stayed with her. He learned everything he could learn from her. He stayed with her for a year and a day. When a year and a day was up, he stood at the mouth of the cave once again. It was time for him to go back down into the world.
And we have turned a bit of a corner. I mean, I still go to schools and people say, oh, here is David Ambrose. He's going to read you a story. And no, I'm not. I'm going to tell. This is a big, big difference. It's a huge difference, actually, because I do believe that for anybody except perhaps the most gifted performers, as soon as they're reading from a text, there is a barrier there between the person who's speaking and the person who's listening. So it's this business of being free to throw away the book, throw away the text, and just let it come out. This is very, very important, and this is what really makes the difference between a storyteller and and a reader of stories. As storytellers, we definitely think of ourselves as being, if we're going to be in one bracket, art form bracket, it's definitely literature. It's not theatre. You know, it's not theatre, it's not dance, it's literature. It's just not, oral tradition. But it's a branch of this other thing that writers and poets are all part of.